Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to the first digital event as part of the Ukrainian series that Archaeology Now is presenting all of this spring. We're so glad that you're here and glad that you're here to learn a little bit more about the ancient history of Ukraine, and especially a group that is legendary for their love of horses and for their astonishing skills at goldsmithing. So, to begin the event this day, first of all, the Ukrainian Consul General has a welcome for everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. I would like to extend special thanks to Executive Director Rebecca Lau and the whole team of Archaeology Now for their professional work and organization of this event and other events under the Ukraine Project series, dedicated to Ukraine's ancient history and culture. I'm confident that you will discover many interesting insights, as well as learn about the origins and formation of Ukraine's ancient and vast cultural heritage. It was a great pleasure to personally attend the previous event at the University of St. Thomas. Today's event topic is the Scythians, a great enigmatic civilization that emerged on the territory of the modern Ukraine from the 8th century BCE, having a significant influence on the cultural development of the world. They were masters of warfare, nomads, and creators of stunning artistic treasures. The artistic legacy, particularly the golden treasures and exquisite artifacts, became the hallmark of Scythians to the modern world. Perhaps the best known artwork of Ukraine's early civilization is the Scythian pectoral, so-called breastplate, found in an ancient burial mound called Tosta Могила, Fat Barrow. The Scythian pectoral dates back to the 4th century BC. It's made of 24 karat gold and weighs more than 2 pounds. It's decorated with intricate and delicately modeled scenes of daily life and animals. The Scythian period in the territory of Ukraine is an integral part of its history and cultural heritage. The big painting depicting the pectoral can be seen right now on display at the University of Texas A&M. This is the exhibit of artworks of a prominent Ukrainian artist and native Houstonian Lydia Bodnar-Balahutrak. It's open till April 25. Please visit. And in these times, when Russian Federation is waging a genocidal war against Ukraine, destroying cities, towns, cultural landmarks, civilian infrastructure, and most importantly, brutally killing Ukrainian people, desperately trying to wipe out our unique identity, the existence of which the enemy so vehemently denies through the ages. We all must know history to better understand the developments that happen in today's world. Because history is who we are and why we are the way we are. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you all at future events and Archaeology Now. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Consul General Vitaly Toroshik. It's been a pleasure to work with your office, the Ukrainian Consulate in Houston, which is a newly formed consulate, and as well the Ukrainian American Cultural Club of Houston and the University of St. Thomas. We've all joined forces to bring a series of events focused on Ukraine to the podiums and the screens of Archaeology Now here in Houston. And especially, we think it's important to focus on this culture because of what's going on in the homeland. There's a large number of Ukrainian immigrants here to Houston who have arrived here starting 2 years ago. So we're proud to help highlight their history and their culture during this war-torn time. And for the rest of you who want to keep up with events, please log on to our website, archaeologynow.org. You'll see a calendar of events. In 2 weeks' time, there's going to be another digital event about, and this one is coming directly from Ukraine, and it's about graffiti that's been left in Ukraine during the war, and how collecting data about this graffiti will hopefully aid in trials to bring people to justice in the future, hopefully when this is all over. In addition, in a couple of weeks, in a month's time, actually, there is going to be a cooking class. A couple of years ago, UNESCO declared borscht an endangered cultural heritage of humanity because of the war. And so, how do you preserve something that's endangered? You teach people how to make it. So, we'll be doing that in a month's time. A Ukrainian chef will be teaching people how to cook borscht and the proper way to drink vodka. So, we hope that you'll be with us for that. So now, turning to today, um, I'm really, really pleased to welcome Dr. Carolyn Willikas to this event. And she's the perfect person to do this because she is what's known as a hippologist, a person who specializes in the history of the horse. And so there's really not that many of them around, and she has become renowned as an expert in the horse in ancient history. She wrote a book on the ancient history of the horse, and then she was submitted an article to the Alexander History volumes put out by Cambridge University Press. She's an assistant professor at Mount Royal University. And so welcome, Dr. Willikas, to this event. And oh, one thing I forgot to mention is I'm sure as things are moving along, you'll probably have questions, which is the cool thing about being in a live presentation. This will be recorded for permanent installation on our YouTube site, but you as a live participant have the opportunity to do something that's really cool. You can pop your questions into the chat, and then you have a chance to interact with Dr. Willikas after the event. So be sure to place your questions as things move along. We love hearing your comments, and we're grateful for your presence here today. And so now, welcome, Dr. Willikas.
All right, thank you so much, Becky. Thank you to Archaeology Now for inviting me to do this. The Scythians are one of my favorite topics, and it was wonderful to have a chance to think about them again and spend some time studying them and looking at their amazing artwork. So now I'm going to do the good old screen share. So hopefully it all works out. So here we go. So is that on full screen? We're looking good. Hopefully, yes. Okay, so yes, as I said, thank you very much to Becky and to Archaeology Now for the invite to come and talk about the Scythians. So I meant to put in a slide about this, but I already have lots of slides. But so I'm up in Alberta, in Calgary, Alberta, and we have quite a substantial Ukrainian population here in the prairies. And here in Canada, we like making giant statues of things and putting them on the side of the road. I don't know why, it's a thing we do. So the small town of Vegreville, Alberta, has the largest statue of one of the Ukrainian Easter eggs in the world. So if you ever make it to Alberta, go to Vegreville and you can see the spectacular giant statue of a traditional Ukrainian Easter egg. But that's not what I'm talking about today. We're going to go way back in time, starting about 2,800 years ago, to try and come to grips with culture or sort of a group of cultures, depending on how you look at it and what perspective you take, that are sort of prominent in the visual culture and some of the literature of the ancient world, but in reality, who can be quite frustrating to try and deal with, try and sort of separate fact from fiction and kind of find the true history of this group. And they are a culture, or they're a group that we commonly refer to as the Scythians. So the term itself, the name itself is a bit problematic. Scythian or Scythian, that's not the name that they would have given themselves. To be quite honest, we don't really know what they called themselves. The name Scythian or Scythian is given to them by the Greeks. So it's the word used to reference them in ancient Greek sources. In Persia, in ancient Persia, Achaemenid Persia, they're referred to as the Saka. So there are these different names attributed to this group. And what it references is nomadic and semi-nomadic pastoralists. So pastoralists are people who are not agriculturalists, so they're not growing crops, they are raising animals, so large herds of animals living across the Eurasian steppe. And we'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. The other problem with these terms is that they're used for a really long period of time. So in terms of sort of the Greek and Persian sources, we have references to Scythians and Saka, by the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. And then even in the 11th and 12th century CE, so like well over a millennium later, we have in Byzantine sources, we still have nomadic groups, horseback riding, bow shooting, nomadic groups, sort of being referred to colloquially as Scythians. So the Byzantine royal lady Anna Komnena in her work, the Alexiad, she refers to the nomads of the steppe as Scythians. And this is in the 11th and 12th century. And obviously the Scythians of the ancient world are long gone by then. So one of the things with the term Scythian or Saka is that sometimes it references a lifestyle. Sometimes it's a way of othering a culture, so a non-urban or a non-settled culture. So this is just something to keep in mind, that when I'm talking about Scythians or Saka, that these are external terms that were given to them by other cultures. One of the reasons why it's really difficult to figure out who they actually were or how they saw themselves is because the Scythians were an oral culture. So they did not have forms of writing. They transmitted their histories, their stories, their lineages, their beliefs, their practices, all of this were transmitted by word of mouth and passed down from one generation to another, which is a very important part of their culture, but it means that we don't have access to any written records, anything written by or produced by the Scythians, because they didn't write. Even trying to figure out what language they spoke, there has been some research on this, but that can be problematic. So we don't know what they call themselves. We don't know if they saw themselves as one homogenous group, and we don't sort of know the ins and outs, the nuances of their cultures, societies, tribal structures, social structures, and things like that. And any written references we have to the Scythians come from other cultures. And the most detailed of this is a Greek text written by Herodotus in the 5th century BCE called his Histories. And in book 4 of his Histories, he spends a fair bit of time talking about the Scythians, or at least his perception of the Scythians. And again, we'll see some more examples of this, but we do have Scythians who appear in Greek art as well, in Persian art. But we have to keep in mind that these cultures are looking at the Scythians with their own biases and their own sort of stereotypes and sort of preconceived notions about them. So how do we figure out who they were? Yes, we can look at the Persian sources, we can look at Greek sources. The late Assyrian stuff has some indication of Scythian involvement and that sort of thing. But to try and get to grips with who the Scythians themselves were and how they saw themselves, we have to look at archaeology. We have to look at the material culture. And again, because they were predominantly nomadic and semi-nomadic, they were not great city building peoples. The sort of key for their survival, to their lifestyle, to their culture was movement. As we'll talk about, some Scythians probably did become settled and urbanized, but by and large, this is a nomadic group, right? They are migrating, they are moving, so they're not building a lot of permanent structures. So when it comes to trying to find the material culture of the Scythians, we're looking predominantly at their tombs. And some of these tombs are absolutely spectacular. We're going to be seeing lots of finds for them. But this too, we need to be cautious and careful, because we shouldn't presume that the things that we are finding in Scythian tombs are a direct reflection of their lived lives, right? In many cultures, ancient and modern, sort of funerary practices around death, are not always identical to practices around life, right? So we need to be aware that we're looking at things that come from the context of death and sort of celebrating the deceased and honoring the deceased and beliefs about death and the afterlife, as opposed to what these people did on a day-to-day basis. And there's going to be a lot of gold. The Scythians are renowned for their gold art and gold artifacts. So if it's so difficult to say anything with clear certainty about who the Scythians were, how they lived their lives, what their languages were, religious beliefs were, societal structures were, then why do they matter? Why give this talk about them? Because they are important. The Scythians kind of represent the intersection of two key factors in Eurasian history. One, the grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, and the horse. And the Scythians really show how these two things shape cultural exchanges, how they shape developments through the movement of people, of goods, of ideas that cross this vast geographical corridor. Many people have called the Eurasian steppe sort of a sea, a grassland sea, or sort of a grassy sea. And when you look at this map, this sort of satellite image of Eurasia, so the Eurasian steppe is this lighter colored, almost turquoisey colored band that really stretches all the way across the center of Eurasia. So I had to change this to miles instead of kilometers, because in Canada we do kilometers, but it's about 5,000 miles, stretching all the way across the center of Europe and Asia. And it's split up into 3 different regions. So in the western part of the steppe, we have the Pontic-Caspian steppe, so sort of on the northern shores of the Black Sea. So this includes modern day Ukraine. Then we have the Kazakh or Central steppe. So this is kind of the heartland of Central Asia. And then to the west, we have the Mongolian Manchurian steppe. So this is where sort of the modern country of Mongolia is kind of running into sort of the border with China. There are a couple little offshoots. So one of the main ones is just west, think of my directions for a minute, west of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. We have kind of this area of Hungary called the Pannonian steppe, that even though there's a little mountain range in between, the Carpathians, it's still considered part of the Eurasian steppe. And while this 5,000-mile long band is not sort of homogeneous in terms of its topography, the key defining feature of the Eurasian steppe is its grasslands. So as you travel through this corridor, it is wide open grasslands. There are some areas where you're going to have mountains as well, or hilly spaces. Some areas we will have some forest. The climate is not going to be consistent all the way across. So the further east you go, sort of into the sort of the eastern parts of the central steppe, and then into the Mongolian Manchurian steppe, you're going to have far more climate variation. This is a land of sort of extremes where it can go down to, and here it'll be in Celsius, I'm sorry, but you'll get the gist that like it goes down to like minus 40 degrees Celsius, sometimes close to minus 50 degrees Celsius in the winter, which is just cold. I mean, we hit minus 40 in Calgary sometimes, and it's not pleasant. And then up into sort of very warm temperatures, you know, plus 30, plus 35 Celsius. So that's got to be getting into like the 90s Fahrenheit during the summer. And it tends to be quite dry and arid. So not great for growing crops. Whereas when you move further west towards the Pontic-Caspian steppe, you can get a more temperate climate. You tend to get more fertile soil. So as we'll see in this western part of the steppe, we do sometimes get a mixture of sort of nomadism and agriculture as well. So the exact lifestyle that these Scythians would have followed would depend on where in this broad expanse of Eurasian steppe they were living. And something else you find across the Eurasian steppe is my favorite animal, the horse. And so the domestication of the horse is key to understanding Scythian lifestyle and the lifestyle of the peoples of the Eurasian steppe in general, even long before the Scythians. So it's difficult to think that for a long time humans lived in a world where horses were solely wild animals, because they have become such an intrinsic part of culture around the world. But the horse was actually a very late domesticate. So, you know, we're domesticating, you know, things like cattle and sheep and goats, you know, sort of 12,000, 10,000, 9,000 years ago. The horse is only domesticated around 5,500 years ago. So probably sometime between 3,500 and 3,200 BCE. There's 2 cultures that are sort of associated with the domestication of the horse, and both come from Central Asia. So you have the Botai culture and you have the Yamnaya culture. So with the Botai culture, the evidence that was being found was horse milk in pottery vessels. And you're not going to milk a wild horse. So this is at least suggesting that there's a taming process going on with the Botai culture. And horse milk remains a really important staple of the diet for the people in Central Asia along the steppe who still practice nomadism today, because it's very high in vitamin C. And when you're nomadic, you don't get a lot of fruits and veggies in your day-to-day diet. So to make sure you're not getting things like scurvy, you consume horse milk or products made from horse milk. And the ancient Greek authors talk about these nomads, talk about the Scythians in particular, as being horse milk drinkers or horse cheese eaters. So this is a long established process. And I've drunk horse milk when I've spent time in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, and then also in Mongolia. And the other culture connected to the domestication of the horse is the Yamnaya culture. So again, they are a nomadic culture coming out of Central Asia. And with the Yamnaya, this is where we start to see horses included in burials and equipment for horses. So whether it's vehicles that have been driven, wheeled vehicles, and potentially skeletal evidence for horseback riding as well. And I had to put a picture of my own horse in there. He's obviously not, this is not a Scythian horse. This is my young horse, Craterus. But when you have horses and you study horses, it's like this unwritten rule that when you give a talk about horses, your horse has to make an appearance in there somewhere. So this is my token. Look, it's my horse in the Canadian winter. So why does the horse matter? Horses revolutionized nomadic life. I mean, nomadism, as we see, there's different forms of it, but at its root, at its foundation, nomadism is about movement. And well, you can walk, you can travel on foot across the Eurasian steppe. It's slower and you're limited into the distance, sort of in terms of the distances you can cover, but also the number of animals you can move, right? Nomads, again, they are pastoralists. Their livelihood, their survival is based around raising herds of animals, what they call in Mongolia the five snouts, basically. So sheep, goats, horses, cattle or yaks, bovines, and then later on camels are added. Camels are domesticated a bit later. And while you can herd these animals on foot, it is exponentially easier to do on horseback. That's why the horse became a central part of herding life. And so when you're on horseback, you can use one horse to control quite a large herd of animals. You can cover larger distances, longer distances, and it just makes life easier. So in terms of day-to-day survival, in terms of the economics of nomadic society, the horse revolutionized this. They changed travel, they changed trade, they changed conquest and the economy. Because of course, as soon as we realize that we can ride horses, which happens soon after their domestication, then all of a sudden you had this way to move, to be seen, and horses very quickly became a part of warfare as well. So the domestication of the horse was the key factor in turning the Eurasian steppe basically into the world's first superhighway. It becomes a major trade route, becomes a route for different cultures to interact with each other, to intermingle with one another. And sometimes this was done peacefully, and sometimes this was done violently. And in many parts of the Eurasian steppe, the horse is still, even in 21st century society, with all of its modern developments and technologies and things like that, the horse is still central to identity and still central to the economy. So I've been talking about nomads and why horses are so important to nomads, and why the fact that the Scythians were nomadic makes them difficult to kind of come to grips with because they're not writing things down. Because again, when you're a nomadic, having a culture based around writing and recording things through the written word isn't really practical, because writing implies things like scrolls and books and the tools of writing, and that stuff gets big and heavy and unwieldy. Anyone who owns a lot of books, who's ever had to move house, will know exactly what I'm talking about. And so from a practical perspective, it made way more sense to preserve things in memory through the spoken word, as opposed to trying to haul scrolls and books and things across the Eurasian steppe. So if we try to sort of look at the general definition of a nomad, and this I pulled from the Oxford English Dictionary, we say that a nomad is a member of a people that travels from place to place to find fresh pastures for its animals and has no permanent home. This is sort of the bare bones definition of a nomad. It involves movement, it involves raising animals, and the reason they move is because of their animals, and they don't have like a brick and mortar home that they continually return to. They tend to have mobile homes. The most famous style is the yurt, which you see in this slide. So I took this photo in 2019 in Kyrgyzstan, up in the summer pastures, which they call the Jailu, up in the high mountain ranges. So nomadism does involve the regular movement of peoples, and it does involve pastoralism, so animal husbandry. But the exact format this takes varies based on environmental conditions. We should not imagine nomads to be constantly moving every single day. In most cases where we have kind of entrenched regular nomadism, these are seasonal migrations. So moving between summer pastures and winter pastures, and then maybe fall and spring pastures. So there's kind of a cyclical route that's followed, often in sort of the more west or eastern part of the steppe, where it tends to get more mountainous in some places. You tend to go up into the mountains for the summer pasture to escape the blistering heat of the lower grasslands. And then in the winter, you come back down into the lower grasslands to escape the harsh winters of up in the mountain passes. So you have this sort of up and down form of migration. In other places where you don't have mountains, it may just be moving across the grasslands to preserve pasture, because all of these animals are going to eat a lot of grass and they need to drink a lot of water. So you don't want to overgraze any one area. So you're going to move to have a steady supply of food for your animals, but also to preserve your grasslands for future grazing seasons. In some cases, we see a mixture of semi-pastoralism and sort of settled agriculture, where you may have herds and certain members of the family or the community will go and migrate with those herds up into the sort of summer pasture, winter pasture, whereas other members of the family, may live in more permanent dwellings in villages or even towns and practice a form of agriculture. So we might see a mixture of pastoralism and agriculture. So there is no one generic form of nomadism in the Eurasian steppe. It's such a massive area with such diverse climate patterns that the nomads are going to, and the people who live there are going to sort of match their lifestyle to where they live. And this can change as well due to environmental occurrences, environmental disasters, and other external pressures, right? So nomads, first and foremost, at their most basic level, they are a people on the move. This is why the horse was so useful. And this movement doesn't just refer to moving their animals around. You also see the cultures themselves shift. One way to think about culture in the Eurasian steppe is that there's often almost this domino effect. And we see this from, ancient history, from sort of the Bronze Age, early periods of horse domestication and nomadism on the steppe, all the way through into sort of the medieval period and things like that, where you have one tribe, one group, one community that maybe experiences an environmental disaster or conflict, external pressures through conquest. And so they move, right? They're like, if I can't make a living here anymore, if I can't survive here anymore, then I'm just going to take my animals and take my family and take my belongings, and we're just going to migrate, because that is the nature of our lives. And so they move, and then they cause other communities to move, and it kind of creates this ripple domino effect. And we see significant periods of this sort of throughout Eurasian history. So even the basic movement of where they go with their animals during seasonal migrations, it's not always exactly the same. Families, groups, tribes, communities, they'll have kind of their set migration patterns, their sort of usual grassland areas that they use. But again, this can shift during unusual climate events or because of external pressures like conflict. So when we think of this movement, there's movement sort of east to west, north to south across the steppe due to external factors pushing the tribes in different directions. But then even in their regular migration routes, we can see shifts and changes, because the idea of land ownership is something that for a lot of these nomadic tribes, nomadic societies, would have seemed very unusual, right? You didn't own the land, you used the land, you grazed the land, but it didn't belong specifically to you. It might belong, you might view it as part of your tribe, but it's sort of this family tends to go this way and that family tends to go that way. And there wasn't this notion of land possession in the same way that we see with more urbanized settled societies or sedentary societies. So where do the Scythians fit into this? So if you look at this map, you can see that this area that we sort of say that the Scythians inhabit in antiquity is massive. I mean, it's basically the entire expanse of the Eurasian steppe. And this is why I said we need to be a bit careful when we think about who the Scythians are, because to imagine that there's just one homogeneous, identical culture across this entire massive expanse is probably generalizing a little bit. There are definitely factors that show similarities between the groups that are living across the steppe in this period, but we can't imagine that, oh, they must all be identical, because that is a huge territorial, geographical, environmental expanse. But when we talk about the Scythians, so they're emerging out of this sort of development of nomadism on the steppe, the domestication of the horse, the movement of the domesticated horse through trade and conquest, earlier nomadic societies that are starting to develop and interact with one another. And then kind of around the 8th century BCE, we have these traditions, these forms of cultural expression that start to emerge that we identify as being Scythian or Proto-Scythian or kind of connected to that group. And we call it the Scythian triad. There's kind of 3 major things that we use to identify Scythians. So one is their weaponry, 2 is their horses, and especially the equipment they're using on their horses. And the third one is their style of art, which we call the animal style art. Another thing, and we'll talk about all 3 of those things, I promise, we'll come back to them. But another thing that the Eurasian steppe really facilitated and that the horse helped to speed up was international trade, right? So if we go back to this slide, we can see that, the sort of pinkish orange area is sort of quote unquote Scythia. And then right to the south of it, we have the massive Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire. So as the Scythians are sort of starting to establish themselves in the archaeological record, so too are the Persians becoming, at this point, the predominant power in sort of Asia. And then, of course, far to the east, we have different parts of the ancient communities in China. And then to the west, we have the Greeks, who are sort of colonizing and settling the western coast of what is now Turkey. And they will eventually make their way in and colonize around the Black Sea as well. So the Scythians don't exist in a bubble. They are definitely interacting with the cultures that live around them. And this leads to international trade. So we know that Scythians are importing or emulating goods, artistic styles that they're experiencing or encountering with their neighboring cultures. And this is not to say that they're just going and copying it. They are adding their own sort of definitive Scythian twists to it based around their own aesthetics and their own cultural ideas. And sometimes we find really cool things. So this is the oldest known knotted rug in the world. I love carpets. I am a rug nerd. I don't know why, I just am. I became one. So this is called the Pazyryk rug. So it comes from southern Siberia, a set of burials called the Pazyryk burials that are considered, part of the Pazyryk culture is considered a Scythian culture. And the reason it survives is by a complete sort of fluke or of nature. So the Pazyryk burials were preserved by permafrost. Basically, they froze after the goods and humans and horses were interred. The permafrost froze them and they didn't defrost. And so in the 20th century, when archaeologists started excavating them, things that we normally would have lost through decomposition were almost perfectly preserved. And this includes a lot of organic goods like this rug. So rug making comes originally probably from Persia. There were probably some rug making workshops in Central Asia as well. So we don't know where exactly this rug came from. Some of the motifs are kind of Persian, some are a bit Central Asian, but then you can see this band of, I think they're elk kind of running around the inside. These are very Scythian in terms of the animal style art. Then the horses and horsemen that you see running around the outside are very Persian. So we're seeing a sort of cultural amalgamation happening here. And it's so cool. I have a replica of this at home because I am a giant nerd. We also see this cross-cultural exchange through other goods. So here we have a saddle cloth for one of the horses that is coming from Iran. So it's a mixture of felt. So the felt tends to be more nomadic, but also wool, gold foil. We've got the tassels. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. Again, it's coming from the Pazyryk burials, which is why this delicate, beautiful fabric has survived. We have gold goods that, again, are coming from exchanges with their southern neighbors. So this torque, which is a neck piece, is coming, it's East Iranian in style. The bracelets with sort of distinctive, the horses, the way they're being depicted is distinctive Scythian animal style art. But then with the turquoise and the style of gold is suggesting that it's coming more from Central Asia, a bit further south towards Uzbekistan and the Karakum Desert. And then these drinking goblets called rhytons, we see them across the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. But this style of the silver rhyton with the sort of animal finial, again, is Persian in style, but this one was possibly made in a Scythian workshop or in one of the Greek colonies for Scythians, and it was found in a Scythian burial. We also have evidence of trade with China, so lacquered wood objects, and the lacquering of wood is very much a Chinese practice. And that's the style of lacquering, which I am not an expert in. Again, in objects coming from the Kazakh burials suggests Chinese origin or having learned these techniques from China. But then the carving on the objects is distinctly Scythian. So again, we see this conversation happening between the Scythians and non-Scythian groups through their art and through their material culture. So how do some of these groups feel about the Scythians? This is always kind of an interesting thing to look at because the Scythians were formidable. They were, as we'll see, renowned warriors and had quite a reputation. And their nomadic lifestyle or semi-nomadic lifestyle sometimes put them at odds or made them their neighbors, their settled neighbors, their urban neighbors feel uneasy. So we know the Persians interacted with the Scythians certainly through trade, but also in more violent means as well. This is a relief in Iran. It's very famous. It's called the Behistun inscription from the reign of Darius the First. So it was started in 521 BCE. So the dude standing with his hand lifted up, that is Darius himself, the great king of kings, the Persian king. And then he's giant, and then he has this band of smaller individuals standing in front of him. So, and he's actually standing on top of one of them. So there was a coup, there was an attempt to usurp his throne, which failed. And so, of course, the key conspirators, they were captured, and I imagine their lives did not end nicely. But the figure I'm interested in is the one circled in blue, the one in what looks like a funny pointy Smurf hat. That is Skunka the Scythian. So he is a Scythian chief or king who was part of this revolt or rebellion against Darius, because the Persian Empire did come to sort of butt up against Scythian territories and sort of start to incorporate some Scythian territory within its broader expanse. So Skunka was involved in this and was, not successful and captured. And so this inscription is massive. It talks about Darius's success and how he put down this insurrection. And we get this reference to a specific noble Scythian named Skunka. And we start to see one of the key identifying factors of Scythians in ancient art, especially the Greek art and the Persian art, and that is their pointy hats. We also know that some Scythians did pay tribute to the Persians. So again, in Iran, there is the remains of the massive palace, Persepolis, started by Darius and then continued by his son Xerxes, and then finished by Xerxes' successor, who I think was one of the Artaxerxes. But it was started in the 6th century, finished in the 5th century, later burnt down by Alexander the Great. But what does remain are the stone parts of the palace, and that includes this spectacular staircase called the Apadana staircase, which has these reliefs of the different satrapies, the different provinces of the Persian Empire, and representatives from those provinces bringing tribute to the Persian king. And so these are the representatives from the Scythians who were part of the Persian Empire. So again, we can identify them by their pointy hats, the type of sword they're wearing, which is a short sword called an akanakes. And then they are bringing their horses because the Scythians become famed for their horses. And so they are a worthy tribute gift of the Persian king. But we shouldn't read this as the Scythians being entirely under the control of the Persians or Darius being the great conqueror of the Scythians, because he certainly isn't. There are some small parts of sort of Scythian territory or Scythian community that fall under the control of the Persians, but the much larger part of it does not. And Darius, at one point in his reign, I think around 513 or so, decides he wants to invade Scythia, sort of the Pontic Scythians, so around the Black Sea, and it doesn't go well. So he comes marching in, he crosses the Bosporus, he comes marching in with this massive, very well-trained Persian army. And the Scythians go, well, why would we stop to fight you, right? Every time Darius gets close to them or tries to attack them, they just gallop away on their horses. And then they'll kind of do guerrilla tactics and they'll harass them and mock them and fire arrows at them and then disappear into the grasslands again. And finally, Darius is like, what the heck? Like, why? Why are you just so afraid to fight me? Because, you know that I will be your master. And so this is coming from the Greek writer Herodotus. he basically has the Scythian king, Thyresis, reply, why would we stop to fight you? I don't run away from any man in fear. I've never done it in the past. I won't do it now. What I'm doing now is just part of my regular life. Even during peace, we move. We don't stay static in one place. Why would I fight you? I'm not trying to defend a city or a treasury or anything like that. I just have my grasslands, and there's lots of them. If you take this bit of grassland, I can just move my herds to other grasslands. Right? He's like, the one thing that we'll fight to defend is our tombs, our ancestral burial ground. So if you can find those, go ahead, try and destroy them, and we'll come fight you. But otherwise, why would we join battle if we don't have to? And eventually Darius, he just gives up. He finally kind of gets to a point where the Scythians line up, on a battlefield to fight him. And then as they're getting ready to fight, a rabbit takes off running across the grasslands, and a bunch of the Scythian warriors go and start chasing the rabbit to go hunting. And Darius is just so insulted by this. He's like, I can't do this. And so he leaves and he goes back to Persia. And this notion of the Scythians being so difficult to come to grips with becomes a central aspect of how they're viewed by non-Scythian communities. And this includes the Greeks. So when we're looking at Scythians in Greek art, we need to be a little bit careful. What we're seeing is probably inspired by ideas about the Scythians, references or descriptions of the Scythians coming from the Greek colonies in the Black Sea. But these figures could also be Amazons, so the mythological warrior women who come from the Eurasian steppe that the Greeks are obsessed with. Could also be Persians. The Greeks in their art kind of mash them all together, especially in the art that's coming from Athens. But these Scythian type figures are very popular in classical Greek art. We know that there are Scythians in Athens because the police force of classical Athens was made up of Scythians. We don't know if these were free individuals or enslaved individuals. The Scythians, especially the Scythian police forces, appear in Greek comedy, where they are a subject of mockery. But at the same time, when you read more sort of military texts and the history texts like Herodotus, their skill as warriors is very well recognized. And Alexander the Great refers to them as being very warlike in Arrian's history of his campaign. So we kind of get this double-sided perception of the Scythians, just like we do with the Persians, where on the one hand, it's like, oh, they're subservient to us and we conquered them. But on the other hand, we can't actually conquer them. And the same thing with the Greeks. It's like, oh, they're these, quote unquote, barbarians that we sort of mock, but then also we're a bit afraid of them and we don't quite know what to do with them. And Herodotus says this again in his histories when he's talking about the Scythians. He calls them, so the Euxine Sea is the modern Azov Sea, and Sea of Azov. And so he says that like the smartest, the most noble, the only sort of notable people in this region are the Scythians. And he calls them just incredibly clever, the smartest people that he knows, because he says they have the cleverest solution he knows of to the single most important matter in human life, which is how to avoid being attacked, how to avoid being conquered. He says they have discovered that to prevent anyone who attacks them from escaping, and how to avoid being caught unless they want to be detected, because they have no towns or strongholds, so they don't have to defend any one area. They're all experts at using their bows from horseback, so they're incredible horse people, both the men and the women, and skilled archers, and they're just so mobile, right? Because they depend on cattle for food rather than cultivated land. So they're basically invincible because you can't burn their crops. They don't have any. You can't burn their towns because they don't have them. Or if they do, they're not that significant. So anytime they're threatened, they can just disappear into the grasslands that they know like the back of their hands. They know where everything is, and they can tease you out to follow them and then get you stranded there. So they have sort of come up with this genius mode of survival. So while in Athens, we know that, the Scythians are kind of an artistic trope. They're sort of a bit of a subject of mockery and comedy, but they are also physically present as a police force. And again, the style of clothing, the Scythian style of clothing or the Persian style of clothing, the two kind of become a bit amalgamated after a while. It becomes fashionable for younger generations, kind of rebellious, rich teenagers and young men to sort of dress in this sort of Persian Scythian style. So there's an awareness of them. But in terms of Greeks who would have known Scythians and seen them on a regular basis and interacted with them, possibly intermarried with them in some cases, we have to look to the Greek colonies around the Black Sea. So the Greeks and then what we call the Pontic Caspian Scythians. So in what is now Ukraine. So the Greeks had this massive period of colonization that starts in the Archaic period, so kind of the 8th century onwards. And one of the major areas that they colonize is around the Black Sea. And that's because of the mineral wealth there, also the agricultural wealth. They're always very concerned with being able to grow grain. And so by the 7th century BCE, we know that there are interactions happening between Greeks and Scythians. These interactions are probably sometimes hostile, but they seem more frequently to have been beneficial to both sides in the sense that there is sort of economic gain happening and interactions happening, cross-cultural interactions. You know, it's not just a case of the Greeks coming in and Hellenizing, Greekifying the crap out of everything, which is what we kind of assumed for a long time, which was super snooty that somehow the Greeks are dominant over everyone. What we're discovering now is there's a lot more cross-cultural exchange, that yes, there are Greek factors and Greek influences coming in, but also that indigenous practices and beliefs and languages and ideas are mixing with the Greeks. And so we get, for example, like multilingual funerary epitaphs, things like that, intermarriage between Greeks and non-Greeks that's happening to sort of create this multicultural population around the Black Sea. So how do we spot them? All right, so we've got this expanse of territory that we ascribe to quote unquote the Scythians. We have Greek perceptions of them. We have Persian perceptions of them. How can we sort of figure out, identify something as Scythian? The most obvious way is through their tombs. So the Scythians use a distinctive type of burial mound that we call a kurgan. And they are these sort of mounded up heaps of soil and earth. So they are, some of them are massive, even the smaller ones, when you're riding across the steppe, once you know they're there, you just start to notice them all over the place, right? So we have the massive kurgans for members of the elite. And then we have smaller kurgans that would have been for just regular individuals. So they're made of mounded up earth and sod. And some of the large ones are seriously large. Chertomlik kurgan, which is in Ukraine, measures about 20 meters high and 100 meters or so across. So it is massive. Of course, this does mean that in antiquity, people knew what these were. So just like we see with, burials in places like Egypt, they are looted often quite soon after burial takes place. But that's, I guess, what happens when you build a massive tomb that people can see from miles around. So we have this mound over top, and then sort of dug into the ground are burial chambers. They tend to follow a set pattern. And then there would also be horses buried. There would be servants buried, grooms, attendants for the horses, things like that. And then the deceased as well. So often the sort of central part of the burial where the key deceased humans are interred, the focal point of the kurgan, these almost take like I kind of want to call it a log cabin, but it's not a log cabin, but there is kind of this wood structure built around them. They are then sometimes placed in wooden coffins with their grave goods. And then horses, again, are an important part of this. So here we see a grave. This is sort of an earlier Scythian one from the 7th century from the region of Tuva in Siberia. So you have the deceased buried next to each other, a man and a woman, and you can kind of see their grave goods. You can see bits of gold glinting, bronze mirrors, things like that. The other one is a drawing of one of the burials from the Beryl Cemetery, which is in eastern Kazakhstan, not Kyrgyzstan, sorry. It's just eastern Kazakhstan. And it's often called the Valley of the Kings for the Scythians. So there's the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, and Beryl is sometimes referred to as the Scythian Valley of the Kings because all of these very rich burials were found there. And here you see an example of how some of the horses would be laid out. So resplendent in sort of ceremonial finery, and then with their legs tucked underneath them, kind of into this crouched position after they were killed. And so this is kind of the standard pattern of these kurgan burials. You have the heaped up mound over top, and then the burial chambers underneath. And then in some cases, there'd be loads of other bits of burial chambers for the different grave goods, both human and animal and stuff kind of included with all of that. And Chertomlik is an example of this. Later on, we start to get some, especially in the Pontic region, we start to get some Greek influence appearing in these kurgans. So some of them like Kol Oba, which is a very famous one. We see still the heaped up burial mound with the sod and the earth, and we have the sort of subterranean burial chambers. But what they've added is a Greek style entrance, and they've sort of created this masonry, almost a beehive masonry inside the turf and earth. So it's like this mixture of what Hellenistic Greek tombs would look like and traditional Scythian kurgans and their construction. And there are tons of these on the northern shore of the Black Sea. And as I said, a number of these are very famous for their grave goods, and just the richness of their grave goods. So these are some of the sort of most notable ones that have been excavated. And you can see how they're very much clustered towards watercourses. So although the Scythians are, again, we think of them as primarily nomadic, water is still really important. And these, where these tombs are situated along these watercourses is also going to be close to a lot of the Greek colonies around here. So again, that speaks to the cultural interchange that's happening between the Greeks and the Scythians. So you have their burial practices. The other thing you're going to find is horses, lots and lots of horses. This is, of course, why I love the Scythians so much. So horses are central to Scythian culture. This is something that's referenced in the Greek sources. We have Scythians that do fight in the Persian army. It's always as horse archers, as mounted archers. And then I love when we see these glimpses of kind of horsiness in their art. So this is a gilt vase from the Tritonluk Amphora. So this comes from the Tritonluk tumulus in the Pontic region. And you can see we have horse training scenes on here. So we have a Scythian who, in the top corner, who is hobbling his horse. So the horse has a pad saddle on and he's putting hobbles on to stop the horse from wandering away. We have another Scythian who's sort of trying to get the horse to kneel or lie down. And then we have three Scythians who are clearly having trouble with one horse who does not want to be tamed or caught. So this is a piece that is probably produced in one of the Greek colonies, whether by a Greek artist or by an artist trained in the Greek style. But what we're seeing is an admixture of sort of Greek artistic style, but Scythian topics. And we see some of these horses look very Greek in how they're depicted, and some of them look very Scythian. So again, we're seeing that interesting mashup. And I had no idea this piece existed until like last weekend. It's like I've never seen it in anything that I've looked at about the Scythians and their horses, probably because it's not made of gold. It's bone. So it comes from the Kol Oba kurgan, and Kol Oba has lots of spectacular gold stuff coming out of it. And it's just a little bone plaque that has a hunting scene with a hound and a hare. But then on the reverse side, you have a Scythian who's clearly been trying to train this horse, work with this horse, and it's not going well because the horse is bolting across the steppe and the Scythian is hanging on for dear life. And you can see he's holding a whip in one hand and then this long rein in the other hand. So he's probably been doing some sort of ground training with this horse. And it's like these whimsical, kind of almost comical pieces that make me just feel this affinity for the Scythians, because I've been dragged around many horses in my time, and shows that realness gives us an idea of what their lives might actually have been like. We find with the horse burials, they are buried with equipment on them. So usually all we get that survives are the metal pieces. So things like the bits that go in their mouths, and then any bits of metal that would have been on their bridles or their harness. Again, these burials from southern Siberia, the Pazric burials, because they were preserved by the permafrost, we have just amazing pieces that have survived to give us a better idea of what some of this equipment might have looked like. Again, we cannot extrapolate that what was used in the far sort of eastern parts of the Scythian community was identical all the way across down to the Pontic Caspian steppe, but we can get a notion of how important these horses were and the attention that was put into producing equipment for these horses. So they didn't have saddles in our sense of a saddle, where there is a treed structure, a solid structure to it, and stirrups and things like that. They used these felt pad saddles. They would have had bridles to go on the horses' faces, and then breastplates or breast collars to hold the pad saddles in place. One of the things we find in the Pazric burials, and also some of the ones from Beryl, are also these spectacular horse masks that are sort of leather and wood, and then some of them have these sort of stylized antlers put on them. So here's where we need to be aware that we're looking at funerary remains. They're probably not riding their horses around on a day-to-day basis with these elaborate masks on them. They're probably not riding them into war with these elaborate masks on them. Chances are this is more ceremonial. This is intentionally being put on the horses who are being sacrificed and interred in the burials, right? You're going to put all the really rich stuff in there, but it still shows the degree to which they wanted to make their horses look extravagant, at least in the afterlife. And again, gives us a notion of the types of equipment they're using, especially with the bits that go in their mounts. We can learn a lot from that. And here we see some, in one case, a reconstruction, in another case, the actual artifacts. So the black model of a horse, these are pieces, again, from the Pasric barrows. So you can see the long saddle cloth, sort of the Iranian style one, the pad saddle on top, the breastplate, the crupper that goes under the tail, the wooden bridle, and then this elaborate mask on the horse's face. And then on the other side, we have, these are reconstructions of some of the pieces that came from the burial kurgans, so from the Valley of the Kings. So when we have equipment like this, we tend to refer to them as like the Pasric Scythians or the Pasric Saka. So this is kind of coming from the more eastern part of Scythian territory. They did bury horses with their deceased. So in some cases, like this Pasric style burial or this Pasric Scythian burial from Western Mongolia, we have a single individual buried with a single horse. So this is usually interpreted as this was the deceased's primary mount, their primary horse. And in some cases, the zoological evidence supports this. A number of these burials have older horses. I mean, the horses being sacrificed and interred are 17, 18, 19 years old. They show signs of having had a working life. So in that case, the temptation is to say this is the deceased and his or her horse. In other cases, we have kurgans that have dozens and dozens of horses interred. So here it's more that large scale elite sacrifice of, you know, in nomadic society, the number of horses you own very much speaks to your status. It's not a case of I own a horse. It's a case of I own hundreds of horses. And Herodotus does give us kind of a description of what he calls sort of royal burial practices or kingly burial practices. We do need to be a bit careful with this because what are the chances he saw this happening? But some of what he talks about with the horses being sort of mounted on wooden staffs and sort of encircling the tomb with attendants or grooms, so humans at their heads. In this case, he has them on top of the horses. But some of the burials, the actual Scythian burials from the massive kurgans do show horses sort of ringing the kurgan and being buried in this propped up way with humans alongside them. So there is clearly some kernel of truth or reality to Herodotus's description. And I mean, these horse burials, you know, we see them amongst in the nomadic cultures of the steppe, you know, from the Scythians onwards. So burying a war horse or burying a prize horse or a favorite horse with the deceased becomes a standard part of sort of Eurasian horse culture. Another way to spot them is their art. So they have a very distinctive style of art that we call the animal style art, or sometimes the Scytho-Siberian style animal art, because again, we do find it from sort of the Black Sea all the way up into Siberia. And it's often these depictions of almost abstract looking animals, like this bridle plaque. So this bronze plaque would have been on a horse's bridle, where you can see there is a little horse figure, and then we have this almost panther or wolf-like beast that's kind of twisted back on itself. This twisting back of it on itself is quite standard. It's quite typical of this style of art. And we got a lot of it in gold. So some of these pieces are tiny. They were put on clothing. They were put on horse harness. Because again, when you're a nomad, the best way to display your wealth is to wear it, right? You're going to have, you know, gold on, you might have gold or silver on your belt. You might wear jewelry. You might have these plaques embroidered on your clothing. Now, we probably shouldn't imagine your average Scythian man or woman walking around on a day-to-day basis, milking their horses, herding their animals, wearing clothes bedecked in gold plaques. Again, this is coming from funerary context, so the gold level has probably been upped a notch or two, but this notion that they had this decorative art and that they displayed their wealth through what they were wearing. You have to be able to ride a horse in it, right? You're not going to be carrying around sacks of money. I mean, they didn't have coinage in the 7th century BCE and stuff like that. So it speaks to their display of wealth, and these are coming from elite burials, but also speaks to the significance of animals in their society, especially so both wild and domestic animals, right? And this kind of, I think, kind of emulates or sort of highlights their relationship with the natural world. So we see loads, I mean, this is just a small sampling of the animal style. All right, we see both predators and prey, and we also see fantastic, almost like what we would call mythological beasts. We do see tattoos. This is something where, again, we need to be careful. We can't say, just like we can't say that all Scythians put these elaborate horse masks on their horses and these felt pad saddles. We can't say that Scythians across the Eurasian steppe practice tattooing, because again, we have the evidence coming from the Pasric burials, and it's just through that preservation of the human remains in permafrost. So normally we only have skeletons. It's been suggested that sometimes you can see evidence for tattooing on skeletons depending on the method of tattooing that's being used, but I don't know if that's true. I'm not a bioarchaeologist, but with the Pasric burials, because the human remains were preserved in the permafrost, we do see surviving tattoos. And these tattoos are all in this twisted animal style. And again, they're quite abstract. And in some cases, they are showing real animals. And in some cases, they're showing sort of mythological beasts. We do not know the purpose of tattooing. I mean, these would have been covered up. They clothed themselves. They wore tunics and trousers. So these aren't things that are going to be displayed on a regular basis. Obviously, there, at least in Pasric, there was some cultural significance to tattooing. And again, the reminder, these are burials for the elites, for the very powerful Scythians. So there's no, it doesn't necessarily mean that those of some of the lower classes are also being tattooed. But we have this tantalizing hint of tattooing culture, at least in the eastern part of kind of Scythian territory. And like I said, they liked a bit of bling, or at least they liked a little bit of bling in their tombs. I mean, these pieces are spectacular. Again, they're probably speaking to a cultural interchange between Greeks and Scythians. So these pieces are likely being produced in Greek workshops or in workshops in the Greek colonies. And then they're either being made by Greek artisans or by Scythian artisans who've been trained by Greeks. So again, that conversation that's happening there. So this is a gold torque. So again, one of these neck pieces where we see two male Scythians in sort of very quintessential Scythian clothing. So this sort of belted tunic jacket type thing. The trousers, so the Scythians are known for wearing trousers, pants, because they're a horse riding culture. And trust me, I mean, you can ride a horse in just a tunic with bare legs. I don't recommend it. It's not super comfortable. Pants make way more sense. And also, when you think of the extremes of weather that you're experiencing in many parts of the Eurasian steppe, you want your legs to be covered up. And then they'll have tall boots as well. And you can see here that they don't have stirrups. They don't have saddles. They're either riding bareback with saddle cloths or with those felt pad saddles. Here we see some other torques. So these ones, the top one is coming from what they call Peter the Great's Siberian collection. So the problem with some of these is because Peter the Great sort of developed his obsession with Siberian, with the gold from what we now know as Scythian burials in Siberia. They were like given to him as gifts. So we don't have the context for them. We don't know exactly where they're coming from, but they do have sort of those hallmarks of the animal style art that we associate with the Scythians. We start to see, again, this is coming more from the eastern part than the western part. So the central and eastern part, where we have these belt plaques that show fighting animals. So we do see this aggression between animals. So where we have, for example, the top one is a tiger attacking a Bactrian camel. The bottom one, we have, it looks like an eagle and a yak and some other sort of zoomorphic creature that are all sort of intertwined in this aggressive, violent act as well. So these are plaques that would have been put on a belt. And to give you an idea of what some of this might have actually looked like, so sometimes, Scythian tombs will be excavated and the fabric is gone. So the clothing has disintegrated, the human remains have disintegrated. So we just have the skeleton, but then we have these gold plaques lying on top of it. So this is how archaeologists were able to determine that these were meant to be sewn on clothing. So the garments themselves would have been just sort of glittering with these gold pieces. And then we have other parts, bits of gold that would have been on sort of the handles and scabbards of swords and bow cases, the hats. So, these rich Scythian burials, literally in some cases, just glittering with gold. So this is the Isig Golden Man. This typically referred to as a man. The skeleton, when the tomb was found, because the individual was buried with so much weaponry, it was presumed it was a man. Some are saying now, having revisited the skeleton, that it actually might be a female. And we do have plenty of evidence, especially from across the central part of the Eurasian steppe, for female Scythians being buried with weaponry and horses, and there being evidence of riding and possibly warfare sort of on their bodies. So some people like to say that this was the inspiration for the Amazons of Greek mythology. It could very well be, but that's not saying that these women are Amazons. They are Scythians, or what we call Scythians. But it shows that in this nomadic society, where being able to move and ride at speed was so central to survival, it wasn't a gendered thing. You had men and women riding and being proficient with the use of weaponry. And just, some of the other clothing they were buried with. So we have this headdress from Pazyryk, and you can see again the gold plaques that were sewn onto it. We have a hat. So the felt is new. This doesn't come from Pazyryk, so it wasn't preserved in permafrost, but there's all of the gold that would have been on this hat. So this is kind of a reconstruction. We have this beautiful felt boot from a female burial in one of the Pazyryk barrows, where that's all glass beads that are stitched onto it. And then there's this sort of tread, this spectacular decorative tread on the bottom that also would have served a practical feature. And my favorite thing is belt buckles. So we have a lot of cowboys here in Alberta, and they love a big belt buckle. And apparently this is nothing new. People who spend lots of time on horseback like big belt buckles. And someday I will legit write an article about this, what it is about horse people and belt buckles. Obviously, part of it is showing off wealth, success, status. But again, these pieces are spectacular. And it's been suggested that in some cases, there would be colored silk put in behind. So where you have those cutout bits on the belt buckle, it would really pop. And in these cases, they're quite cool because we also see human figures and their horses on them as well. So the Scythians were known for being warlike. Alexander the Great even acknowledges their prowess in battle. And this is something that we do see in their art, and not always on objects that you would expect. So this is it's a small little piece. It's a comb. It is a gold comb. It's called the Saloka comb because it comes from the Saloka kurgan, or the Saloka tumulus. And what we see here is one of these amazing examples of sort of Greek style craftsmanship representing Scythians. So these are undoubtedly Scythian men. They're wearing Scythian clothing, though the mounted figure is wearing a Greek style helmet. So again, we have that international trade going back and forth. And the detail on it is amazing. We call the shields peltas. These are wood and leather shields. I'll show you an example in a minute. And the short sword, the akanakes, these belted tunics. You can see the one figure on foot has more of that peaked Smurf style hat as well. And then the all-important horses. So they for shields, when they were carrying shields, they seem to have carried these wood and leather shields, which would not strike you as being eminently practical when it comes to things like axes and swords and spears. But we're going to discover the Scythians are predominantly a culture that tends to preference archery, mounted archery. So the idea is you're not fighting in hand-to-hand combat with your opponents. You tend to be fighting from a distance. So we do have some of these shields that have survived from the Pazyryk burials. And then they do carry swords. It's a very specific type of sword. So it's a short sword. It's not a massive long sword. It's almost like a little dagger. The style, sometimes the style is attributed to the Persians. Sometimes it's attributed to starting with the Scythians, but both carry a similar type of sword. So it's called an akanakes. Where it's very distinctly Scythian is in the scabbard, so the case that you put the sword in. And the ones that we get coming out of funerary contexts often have this elaborate gold decoration over top. They also use war axes. They almost look a bit like a pickaxe. So here we have one example. And in Greek art, we often see Amazons, so these warrior women carrying these Scythian style war axes, which would have just, I mean, they must have packed a punch. And I put this vase in because I love the attempt to show the horse frontally. That's just like my art history side coming in. The armor they tended to wear is what we call scale armor, so not like a metal breastplate, but pieces of leather or metal that are stitched over top of one another. So there's a lot of mobility to it. So when you're on horseback, this just gives you greater freedom of movement. And then we get different styles of helmets that we find in the burials. Some of them are kind of Greek in style. Some of them are kind of a mishmash. And then other times, of course, we see them helmetless in the art as well. But what they are most famous for is being masters of the bow. I mean, the Scythians become one of the first significant sort of horse archery cultures of the Eurasian steppe. They set a precedent that is followed for millennia afterwards. So what you see on this slide is a graitas. So that was the bow case. It was the quiver, so to speak. So the graitas is a very distinctly Scythian piece of equipment. So it would hang off of their left hip, and it held their arrows. In some cases, based on the finds in kurgans, up to 200 arrows in one quiver, and it held their strung bow as well. So it just made it easy to access while they were on horseback. And here we see that this graitas was quite spectacular. So this had this gold case that went over top. The style of art is, again, this mixture of sort of Greek and Scythian, where you have the nod to the Scythian animal art, but then these Greek figures. And this is actually thought to be showing the story of the Greek hero Achilles. We actually have 4 of these that are identical. So they were obviously made in the same workshop and then exported. So 3 of them come from kurgans in what is now Ukraine, and 1 of them comes from the royal burials in northern Greece, in Macedonia. So the Macedonian burials in Igi, in the so-called tomb of Philip II. So the tomb that has been ascribed to the father of Alexander the Great. So that, again, kind of speaks to the commercialization of these objects and the interest in them. So the Scythian bows are tiny. They were incredibly powerful. So you can see here on this, the Saloka cup, we have one hunter with a spear, and the other hunter has this tiny little bow. These are not children's weapons. You may be like, oh, what's this tiny little thing? So they're what we call composite recurve bows. They're made of layers of material, and they fold back on themselves. So they are short, and the tension in them is incredible. So they're immensely powerful. And the size is key for using on horseback, right? You're not, I mean, you can carry a massive long bow on horseback, but it's awkward, it's unwieldy. You're likely to wonk your horse on the hindquarters with it. And because the Scythians become so adept at using their bows, one of their sort of most iconic things is what we come to know as the Parthian shot, where the horse is galloping away and they twist around on the horse's back and fire their bow over their horse's hindquarter at their enemies. And you can't do that with a large bow. So these bows, they engineer this new style of bow that is incredibly successful, because versions of this are consistently used on the Eurasian steppe from this period, certainly well through Genghis Khan and the Mongolian Empire. So again, just giving you an idea of size and the fact that they use them while riding, but they also use them on foot. And we don't find tons of bows in burials. In part because they are made of organic materials, they don't always survive, but also these bows would have taken an incredibly long time to make. In some cases, I think I've read of master bowyers today who still make these traditional composite bows. They can take up to a couple of years to make one of these. And they have to be maintained very carefully. So probably what we're seeing is that they're being passed down from one generation to another. They're kind of becoming like family objects, family weapons. What we long thought is that when we talk about the Scythian composite bows, that they were layers of horn and wood and sinew. what has been discovered by looking at the examples that have survived in at least the western part of the Scythian territory, so in the Pontic-Caspian region, is that there wasn't any horn on these particular bows. That seems to be something that was happening further east. These bows are made up of different types of wood, and then they still have they have a fish belly glue put on them made from sturgeon. And then they have sinew, hammered sinew, probably from cattle, wrapped around them to give them that springiness. And like they had to be perfectly made. If there was any flaw in them because of the amount of strain that they would be put under when they're being strung and then used, they would just shatter and explode. So it took incredible skill to make one of these bows. And we also have loads of arrowheads that are coming from Scythian burials and outside of Scythian burials as well, because they are made of bronze, so they do survive. And just on this one slide, I mean, you can see the diversity of arrowheads that they had. This is from one Goritis in a burial. So it was in one quiver. So they clearly have arrowheads designed for specific tasks, jobs, roles, which again speaks to the importance of archery in their society. And the last thing I want to talk about is, I mean, trying to picture the Scythians, right? We have such a sparse amount of evidence for them. You know, we don't have their voices, we don't have their words. So we have to rely on the fragments, the bits and pieces that we've got to try and kind of piece together who they are. And yes, they had horses. Yes, they were warlike. Yes, for their elites, they built these massive kurgans and they were full of this wealth of grave goods. But you then sometimes, like with that bone plaque that showed the runaway horse, or the Saloka Emperor that showed kind of those horse training scenes, you see these glimpses of life. Again, keeping in mind, I mean, this is a gold piece. It would have been very expensive, again, commissioned and then buried in one of these Scythian tombs. But we see, for example, the stringing of a Scythian bow, this tiny bow. I have a functioning replica of a Scythian bow, and this is how you string it. When I first started to go to the archery range, everyone would yell at me, being like, "You're gonna break it, you can't do it that way." I'm like, "No, this is how you're supposed to string a bow this small." It's literally what the art shows. Like, that's how they did it 2,400 years ago. So again, you see those little pieces of information. We have the guy who looks like he's having a tooth extracted, so apparently he had a toothache. We have another individual who's having an injured leg being bound. So just sort of the nuts and bolts, the grittiness, I guess, of day-to-day life. Here we have another silver gilt cup where we have two Scythians. You can see the quivers hanging from their left hip. They're kind of holding a spear. They've got these spectacular beards and these ornate tunics and trousers, and they're just like having a conversation. And then this little plaque where the fellow, again, you can see his Goritis. He does appear to be holding a short sword in one hand, and then he's got a drinking right on in the other hand. And then I want to finish with, I mean, what is possibly one of the most spectacular pieces of Scythian art. It was mentioned in the introductory address, and that is this pectoral. It is just unbelievable. So it was found in one of the kurgans in what is now Ukraine, and I just love the juxtaposition of it. I mean, aside from the craftsmanship, which is spectacular, so we had like 24 individual pieces that were made to be put on this massive sort of chest piece. You know, the bottom register is incredibly violent, right? You have griffins, you have these mythological beasts and feline type characters tearing horses apart and tearing wild boar apart. And then in the upper register, you have like these bucolic scenes of everyday life, you know, these bucolic scenes of Scythian animal husbandry. You have two fellows who are, it looks like they're preparing a sheepskin for, you know, being turned into something. You have another guy who's milking a sheep. You have a mare and her foal. You have a calf and her cow. You have a horse who's just like about to give its face a scratch, right? So you have this mashup of, you know, this incredible violence on the bottom register, and then this exquisite glimpse into life, into day-to-day life, which is so rare to find for the Scythians because of paucity of evidence we have that gives us this like, oh yeah, you know, they're also these animal herders. You know, animals are so central, so fundamental to who they are. And what I particularly like is, you know, you have these fellows with their sheepskin, but they still have their bows, right? They're still hunters, they're still warriors. You can see the graitas above the sheepskin, and then another one just underneath one of the crouching men. So thank you very much. This is another one of these, which is a saddle plaque where we have, again, you can see our hunter hunting some deer with his bow. Scythians are a fascinating culture. Their work is, I mean, they're just unbelievable. You know, part of me dearly wishes that we had more information from their own mouths, from their own stories. But at the same time, there is this thing about trying to figure out who they are, trying to piece together their story from the fragments of their history and their culture that survive. So thank you very much. Thank you again to Archaeology Now for giving me this opportunity. And you know, a reminder that there is loads of super cool videos, different programs posted on their YouTube channel. So if you enjoyed this, and hopefully you did, be sure to check out some of their other videos as well. And happy to take any questions.